This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next 60 minutes, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. Let's start with a quick run through the markets for you, however. The second quarter so far has been a pretty interesting study in contrast, depending on the market that you're looking at. If you're looking at the NSE 20 in Kenya, for example, that's actually been relatively flat, down by about 1% so far in the quarter. The JSE, however, the top 40 in the All Share, on the other hand, those have been on an absolute tear. The top 40, for instance, up over 17% so far in the quarter, and today's gain of about 2.9% simply added to that. Despite all the restrictions and the negative data we've seen out of South Africa, the equities are telling a very different story. Here's what's coming up tonight. Egypt sets a daily price cap for the cost of treating coronavirus patients at private hospitals. Nigeria moves to the second phase of easing restrictions, and it opens hotels and places of worship. And a Zimbabwean entrepreneur who ventured into online pizza sales is looking at a windfall profit. Our starting point tonight is in North Africa, Egypt to be specific. Authorities over there have capped the daily charges for the treatment of COVID-19 patients at private hospitals at $626. Now, the government cited a range of complaints from the public over inflated prices in making that decision. The health ministry stipulated a top-tier payment bracket of between $469 to $625 for patients in intensive care and who require a ventilator. The daily cost for patients who are in isolation and not in ICU and they do not need a ventilator, they can breathe just fine on their own, has been set at between $90 to $187. The health ministry says it received reports of prices that were simply not in line, it says, with the cost of services at these private facilities. Authorities recently expanded the facilities where virus patients can seek treatment to include private hospitals. Initially, they were limited to only state-run, publicly owned institutions. Let's explore this in a bit more detail. CGTN's Adel El Marouki joins us now live from Egypt's capital. So, Adel, the health ministry has announced these price caps, but is the government covering some of the other costs of treating those infected with COVID-19?
So the government is basically, Ramah, covering all the expenses through its own facilities, public hospitals and quarantine facilities that the government has built especially for COVID-19. And everyone who gets admitted to it gets full coverage, no payment, completely free of charge, and the government is totally covering that expense. But the entire government capacity represents less than half of Egypt's entire healthcare system, and therefore the private sector has to be engaged in the fight against the pandemic. Now, we've seen in the recent weeks that there has been more or less sort of corporate style abuse or supply and demand versus pricing in healthcare, which has seen the private hospitals issuing price lists for their services going way beyond the cap that has been limited up to crossing the $1,000 a night, depending on the cases and the severity of the infection. And as you've mentioned briefly, the system that they need ventilators, intensive care unit, and so on. So the government has actually intervened to set prices for the market so that there wouldn't be any abuse from the private sector towards those who need healthcare immediately. And therefore, the range, as you've said, and I'll repeat just briefly, is it's from $100 to $200 daily for citizens for people who are admitted in hospitals and do not need anything beyond hospitalization and regular healthcare. It goes up to a range from $470 to around $630 for those who need bigger care, intensive care units, ventilators, as you've mentioned. And all these prices include the blood work and scans needed for fighting the pandemic. So they should not by any means exceed that amount with every service, including to fight and to cure them for the COVID-19 pandemic and disease.
Indeed. Let me get back to something that you alluded to in your response there. There are 376 hospitals that can handle COVID-19 patients at the moment. But what is the utilization rate like at the moment? Are they all operating at full capacity, or is the spillover going to run into the private sector now?
So the official government stance is that so far it has reached an 84% capacity of the beds dedicated to the pandemic. 84% in the government services as well. It does not include the private sector. But it doesn't mean that the situation is all sweet and people can find. No, we are seeing a lot of people asking for and are suffering to find locations. Just a little over a week ago, there was a controversial issue where a doctor has passed away because he failed to find a spot to get treated for the pandemic, and he was for the coronavirus, and he was actually infected on service as he serves in the front line of fighting the pandemic. At the same time, the controversy was fueled by an actress who the government managed to find a spot for, but even that actress was not admitted to Cairo. She had to be transported to a different city to find location. So there is a challenge in finding spots and seats. The government is also not opening the doors widely to accept any case to its facilities. Only critical cases are admitted. There are many people who have been advised to stay at home and get the cure and treatment in the house. The government has been taking the lead of preparing about 10 million medicine kits for COVID-19, and it has been distributing them to the registered people who are infected at their houses and on the residential areas.
Where are private medical insurers in this crisis? Are they taking on some of these payments for COVID-19 patients in particular, or are they staying away and saying, look, we can't touch this because this is a pandemic, and that essentially would fall afoul of some of the reinsurance contracts we have?
Of course, by law, if there is a status of pandemic, then everyone must cover their own expenses, and insurers, of course, have their back doors safe and they cannot pay for such a case. But luckily, Egypt has not announced an official status of a pandemic, and therefore insurers are obliged by law to cover for all the expenses. Not that only, in fact, they have been seeing a tremendous increase in subscriptions and people purchasing their packages during these couple of months, and they cannot reject it because basically they fit the standards, their laws are still intact, and the government has not announced a status of epidemiology or epidemic standard within Egypt. What Egypt has done basically is amended its emergency law to accommodate measures that the government can take to face health crisis, but it has not declared a health risk or health crisis yet, and therefore it's quite lucky for the public, for the people. You know, most Egyptians are under the poverty line, and therefore this has been quite a supportive move, and insurers so far cannot escape.
Indeed. One last question for you, Adel. We've seen the country change curfew hours. We're seeing a gradual resumption of international flights. It may come either in the second half of this month or the first half of July. But what else is in Egypt's strategy of gradually easing restrictions as the country moves to coexist, for lack of a better word, with COVID-19?
So basically, the government, while opening up economically and banks and stock market and starting to allow people to go back to work, it has increased the curfew hours by 1 hour. So instead of starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, it now starts at 8 o'clock. At 9 o'clock in the evening. It starts at 8 o'clock in the evening. But given that it has opened up the space for business to go on, banks now operate more hours. They are not back to their full capacity or full workday yet, but they are going there. We are seeing public transportation being open with restrictions that everyone would wear face masks. Hotels have started operating. Only those that have applied for the measures and fit the criteria for the health measures that the government has set for them to operate. But this will go on for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, by mid-June, the government says it will reevaluate the entire situation. How has this been moving and affecting the infection rates. And this is the key line here, the borderline and the all governing set of rules that will help the government to take decisions. Is this the rate of infections, are they dropping, are they the same, or are they increasing? And by mid-June it will take more measures. It could see mosques and churches and other worship houses being opened for the first time since Egypt reported COVID-19 cases in mid-March. And therefore gradually the government will take steps, and it will more or less improvise based on the situation itself. But it says it has all scenarios ready, all possibilities are there, whatever the pandemic moves and the infection rates change. The government has set rules to manage this sort of infection, and of course it all depends whether the healthcare facility can accommodate the numbers that are ongoing or not.
Indeed, we leave it there for the time being. Adel Mahrouki in Cairo, thank you very much. Now, we're still in Egypt. Scientists over there have been modelling how this particular pandemic might play out in the North African state. Worst case scenarios included, as Adel just mentioned. Egypt at the moment has just over 26,000 positive cases of COVID-19. But one group of scientists over there is forecasting the country could have as many as 40,000 by next week. Here's Adel Mahrouki once again with that report.
The COVID-19 pandemic has cast a shadow over future planning. In efforts to assist the government with more precise projections, a group of Egyptian scientists have been analyzing COVID-19 data. They've been compiling satellite imaging and health ministry data to predict epidemiological trends in Egypt.
We are using dynamic algorithms which have the capacity to change projections based on the change in the actual data. We studied real data from 10 days ago, and we built from it an assumptive reality in the future for the following 10 days. But we cannot make forecasts for the next 1 or 2 months to come.
Using remote sensing capabilities, we tracked the nitrogen dioxide emission which results from human activity and traffic, thus to find a relation between crowding and the increase in new COVID-19 infections. That helps us to answer one crucial question: how effective are the preventive measures the government enforces?
The data gathered is used to produce 4 different COVID-19 infection simulations. Egypt's Minister of Higher Education says their study assumes that the actual infection figures are 5 times the official numbers.
We want to know what is the maximum possible infection. The flattening in this curve tells us that all future scenarios are still possible. 100,000 cases is possible. The million figure is possible. Even the 5 million and so on. Our models are trying to confirm that range. What we are sure of is that we will reach 50,000 cases. It's impossible to disregard that figure.
This is just one project among the COVID-19 research Egypt is undertaking. Authorities say the country has so far produced 50 studies concerning the pandemic, while the entire continent has registered 64. Projections released at the start of the month suggest that Egypt will reach the 40,000 case mark around June 10th. The data also indicate that every 10 cases in Egypt infect 14 others, which put the nation at the upward trend phase. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And we're still in Egypt. Citizens over there have largely been abiding to a new law that requires them to wear masks in public spaces or risk a fine of around $250. That law came into effect over the weekend. It's the latest in a raft of pandemic response measures, which include closing off airports to international travel, closing eateries, and of course, halting operations in schools as well. The country is looking to produce some 30 million cloth masks a month to meet domestic demand. Back in May, the government said it would offer cloth masks at around $6 each. It said that mask could be used for at least a full month.
This decision came in at the right time, to the extent that masks and glove sales here have surpassed their limits in ways we have never seen in years. Let me tell you something. Even in the past few months, when the virus started spreading, we did not see this much buying. People used to come in and buy 1 box, maybe 50. But today and yesterday, mask sales have surpassed their limits.
People are following the rules. It's good that people are becoming more aware and abiding by this decision. Even if the decision did not include a fine, People today are protecting themselves, protecting their homes, protecting their families. This is the best decision to have been taken.
All right, and a quick run through some corporate headlines now. Let's start in healthcare. Mediclinic International, it's an owner of a chain of private hospitals in Southern Africa, the Middle East and Switzerland, has reported a net loss of $394 million for the full year that ended on the 31st of March. Now, the company reported a loss of $189 million over the same period last year. Mediclinic operates some 77 hospitals in those three areas. It has suspended all non-essential capex, and it says a dividend for the year is also suspended to preserve cash during this pandemic. Also, the Bank of Tanzania has authorized the merger of TIB Corporate Bank with TPB Bank in a move that's aimed at improving the performance of the two financial institutions. This is the third merger that TPB Bank is witnessing after initially incorporating Twiga Bancorp and Tanzania Women Bank as the Treasury is doubling efforts to improve stability and the performance of Tanzania's banking sector. Further afield, Comair, which operates Kulula and the British Airways franchise in South Africa, has warned that profits for the year to end June will fall by at least 100% as the company continues to battle for its survival. Now, the airline operator said in a statement that its business rescue practitioners say the carrier is unlikely to resume business before November, as it is in need of a substantial cash injection. The practitioners are, however, progressing in discussions with 6 potential funders to recapitalize the airline and resume domestic flights by the 1st of November. And finally, still in the aviation sector, Qatar Airways CEO has warned Airbus and Boeing against resisting the airline's request to defer aircraft deliveries in a battle over who should bear the cost of the pandemic's economic damage. The state carrier is in talks to push back deliveries. Qatar Airways has ordered tens of billions of dollars of aircraft from the world's 2 largest aircraft manufacturers. But after a plunge in demand for air travel, it says it will instead be shrinking its fleet that's currently holding around 200 aircraft. That's a run through your company news. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. We'll take a look at a new solar power plant in Somalia that will quadruple one city's generation capacity. And electric motorcycles are easing daily burdens for rural women in Zimbabwe. That story's coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Nigeria has further eased its COVID-19 lockdown, allowing for essentially full reopening of the economy within some limits. This is in spite of an increasing number of COVID-19 cases in the West African economy. CGTN's Deji Badmus filed this report.
Nigeria's COVID-19 numbers have now passed the 10,000 mark and treatment centers are running out of bed space. But faced with a looming recession, the government has now decided to move to the second phase of its eased lockdown.
Hotels may reopen, but must observe all mandatory non-pharmaceutical interventions. Restaurants other than those in hotels must remain closed for eat-ins. Gyms, cinemas and nightclubs are closed until further evaluation. Farmers are requested to please go ahead with their normal activities provided they observe all mandatory non-pharmaceutical interventions. All schools to remain closed until further evaluation. Places of worship, restricted opening will apply subject to the guidelines issued by the PTF as well as the protocols agreed by respective state governments working with religious leaders.
The decision has been well received by the public, even though some are still asking for more measures to be eased.
If flights are opened up to fly, domestic flights, then the interstate travel should equally be opened.
We are going to allow places like churches open, and I think the schools should as well open.
Nigeria is currently in an active stage of community transmission of COVID-19. The number of confirmed cases are rising. 35 of the country's 36 states are now affected, including the federal capital, Abuja.
When we started this exercise, we had only 5 testing stations. Now we've ramped it up to 28. Without correspondently comes an increase in the number of tests. We've gone beyond 60,000 now. So that reflects in the number of confirmed cases. As we even open up and accommodate more enterprises, because we are trying to have a balance between livelihoods and lives. There's a likelihood of the increase in transmission in cases, but that should not be a source of despair.
The central government has made it clear that the next phase of the country's fight to stop the spread of the virus will rest heavily on the shoulders of states, local governments and local leaders.
20 local governments out of 774 account for 60% of confirmed cases in Nigeria today. So where are these 20 local governments? They are in communities. It means that we have reached the epitome of community transmission, and we must get the communities involved.
Despite the easing, the nationwide curfew remains in place but has now been reduced by 4 hours. Lagos still remains the epicenter of COVID-19 in Nigeria, accounting for around half of the total cases. Now, curbing infections here could go a long way to ending the outbreak in the country. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
It's not just Nigeria that's easing its pandemic restrictions. Ghana is doing pretty much the exact same thing, but it's keeping its borders closed. This comes after it recorded 38 deaths out of nearly 8,300 reported cases of COVID-19. Some religious gatherings will be allowed to take place on the 5th of June, that's this week Friday. Secondary schools and universities will be opened to students who have exams from the 15th of this month. The coronavirus outbreak has affected the country's economic growth. Analysts, in fact, are forecasting an expansion of just 1.5% this year. Ghana recently secured $1 billion in emergency funding from the International Monetary Fund to help ease the impact of this pandemic. Over in East Africa, in Uganda to be specific, President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni says that the country will lose about $1.6 billion a year in earnings from tourism as visitors stay away because of this pandemic. The head of state, however, did not give a specific time frame for any potential recovery. The latest available data from the country's statistics office shows that Uganda earned $2 billion from tourism activities in 2017, up from $1.7 billion the previous year. Tourism is one of Uganda's economic mainstays, a key source of foreign currency earnings, because the East African country attracts visitors to see a whole range of wildlife across the state. The IMF said last month that Uganda's tourism earnings are expected to fall by at least 54% in the 2019-2020 fiscal year and 52% in the one that follows. Uganda has so far recorded some 450 cases of COVID-19. No deaths, however, have been reported. On to Somalia now. A new solar power plant in the seaside capital of Mogadishu could effectively quadruple the city's generation capacity and cut power bills for residents. The proprietors of the company that built this plant say the switch to solar, especially among businesses, should provide a fairly large amount of relief from huge bills from diesel-generated electricity. CGTN's Beryl Oro has that story.
The demand for solar power is growing in Africa. Companies are now stepping in to provide safe, clean and affordable energy solutions to fill the gap by allowing interested customers to get crucial power in a country with no national grid. Beko, Somalia's largest electricity supplier, has been producing 8 megawatts since March and is expected to increase to 100 megawatts by 2022. The plant cost $40 million to construct.
Currently, I can say we are not getting more than 15, 16 megawatt of solar and I'm sure it needs more than 300 megawatt of solar, and people are, getting used to install solar power plants. Like Beko, we are the first company installed, the solar power plants, 8 megawatt, up to 100 megawatt we are going to, but every state, I should say, every, region, they are installing solar power plants right now.
Beko, which also transmits and distributes power to Benadir, Lower Shebele and Middle Shebele regions, already reduced the electricity cost to $0.36 per kilowatt hour from $0.49 per kilowatt hour.
Nowadays, the whole world, they are going to the green energy, and Somalia is one of the best places to install solar power plants. Why? Because we are getting more than 3,000 hours sunshine. In Europe, they might get in less than 1,000 hours, and still they are installing solar. But in here, we have more than 3,000 hours. So it's a very good chance for all Somalis to install solar power plants.
Currently, each major city is powered by private companies that largely rely on diesel generators. Mogadishu's total installed capacity is at 35 megawatts against a demand of 200 megawatts.
The usefulness of solar panels is that you invest one time and there is no running cost and limited maintenance. That is why there was a reduction in the price of electricity in Mogadishu after they were installed.
Beko's solar panels now supply power for 4 hours per day to its 300,000 customers.
I am very happy about the discounts we get year after year. I have stable electricity for 24 hours now that does not damage my air conditioners and freezers.
Officials say that at present 85% of Somalia's population has no access to electricity, with 60% of them living in remote villages. And this is just one nation in sub-Saharan Africa whose population of almost 600 million live without a solution to the present energy poverty. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
And keeping with that green power theme, in a rural Zimbabwean district of Wedza, a project aimed at leasing electric motorcycles to local communities has been set up. The program is helping to bring income lines to poor women, and it's easing the burden of having to look after their families. CGTN's Daniela Pearson looks at how their lives are changing as a result.
The three-wheeler, known as Hamba, is leased to women in Zimbabwe in groups of up to 5. They can now carry farm produce to distant markets, offer transport services to villagers, and use the motorcycle for domestic chores.
Women in the rural areas carry the burden of carrying firewood, going to fetch water to drink, and carrying school kids to the school. So as Mobility for Africa, we saw that we need to lessen the burden on women. So we needed to test with the women so that we can see if they can be able to do some productive work during the time by saving time and saving their income.
We used to carry firewood on our heads for very long distances of 2 kilometers, but now it's much easier as this tricycle has taken away that burden.
Users pay an equivalent of $15 a month to lease the Hamba as a group. It has a maximum range of 100 kilometers and costs about $1 to change the batteries charged at a solar-powered station.
The project is targeted to rural women and many other service providers. So we have noticed that it's not everyone who can afford to buy it. So we are going to sell it to those who can afford to buy it, but at the same time we will continue leasing, because those rural women, what should their future look like if we just take our Hambas and then start selling them?
Health workers in the area say many women give birth at home, while others walk 12 kilometers to the nearest clinic. Pamhidzi Mutunya ferries an average of 4 people a day and collects medication for patients.
This Hamba motorcycle has made it easier for me to ferry patients to and from the hospital. We now have fewer cases of pregnant women giving birth at home due to lack of transport to the clinic, as was the case before.
Mobility for Africa is in the second phase of the pilot project before it can go commercial. The hamper is assembled in Harare with kits made in China. Once it starts selling, it will go for $1,500 per bike. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
At 18:30 GMT, time for another break. Here's what's coming up shortly. We'll explore China's plan for a free trade port that's covering the entire province of Hainan. And we'll also be looking at the fortunes of e-commerce in the Middle East as the region continues to battle the COVID-19 pandemic.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time? Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Welcome back. Let's run through some of the stories that are making your headlines at this hour. There are nearly 158,000 cases of COVID-19 across Africa. So far, more than 67,000 people have recovered, but sadly another 4,000 people have died. The World Health Organization is warning that nearly 250 million Africans could contract this disease in the first year of the pandemic. In Nigeria, security forces in the northwestern state of Katsina are pursuing armed bandits following a raid they executed over the weekend. These bandits killed at least 18 people, including a local government official, and they stole thousands of livestock. Witnesses say that they also killed a local leader, Abdul Hamid Sani, after they attempted, unsuccessfully, to kidnap him. They also said that as many as 500 men on motorcycles headed off with the stolen livestock towards other villages. Health officials in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the continent's biggest copper producer, have confirmed the death of 5 people from a new Ebola outbreak. The deaths in the northwest of the country occurred between the 18th and the 30th of May. Results were confirmed on Monday. This outbreak in Equateur province was detected just as another one in the eastern end of the country was coming fairly close to its end. And finally, Chinese medical specialists in COVID-19 have held their first meeting with Sudanese health officials in the country's capital of Khartoum. They have just completed a mission to Algeria. That's the run through your headlines. On to China now. Authorities over there have unveiled a master plan to establish a free trade port covering the entire Hainan province. The plan calls for 39 institutional reforms in order to make the southern island a key piece in China's policy of opening up the world's second largest economy.
The Hainan Free Trade Port covers the entire island, and in its essence, it's a special customs area that exempts tariffs for most goods. In addition, the island will eventually become an open region for the free flow of production factors, including capital and human resources. The Hainan Free Trade Port Master Plan is drafted based on China's 6 years of experience in experimenting free trade zones on a national scale. The free trade port allows more freedom in trade and investment compared with free trade zones. The president of the China Institute for Reform and Development, Chi Fulin, says that the free trade port shows China's commitment to globalization.
Free trade port is currently the most advanced form of economic openness. The Hainan Free Trade Port features institutional openness and benchmarks the common rules and regulations of the world's freest trade port. The Hainan Free Trade Port offers multiple tax preferentials and thus fits into the global trend for zero tariffs, zero subsidies, and zero barriers.
The master plan outlines a two-phase implementation. The government will initially reduce trade and investment barriers in the first phase that ends in 2025. It will most importantly establish a regulatory framework to create a customs area on the island separate from the rest of China. In the second phase, the government will improve the framework to fully open the island's economy by 2035.
China needs a high-level free trade port like Hainan in its economic system to lead the country's economic openness. From this perspective, I think the Hainan free trade port is a strategic and forward-looking arrangement.
Song Yaotian, CGTN.
Over in Europe, in the meantime, France's Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire says that the country's economy might contract by 11% this year due to the coronavirus pandemic.
The GDP figure that will be presented to the Public Finances Council is at -11% for France's economic growth in 2020. It is a figure that has no equivalent in France's modern history. It is a figure that marks the brutality of this economic crisis that we are experiencing. And it's a figure that also shows the hard times that await us.
The finance minister's comments come as the French government allowed restaurants and bars to reopen on Tuesday. The minister said that the businesses would continue to benefit from a government-funded solidarity fund until the end of the year. France imposed one of Europe's strictest lockdowns in mid-March, and it only started to gradually remove restrictions from the middle of May. Over in Germany, hotels have started to reopen with relatively strict hygiene and social distancing guidelines firmly in place. This comes after 2 months of closures due to this pandemic. Hotels in the southern state of Bavaria, which has the highest number of COVID-19 infections, started to reopen last Saturday, just in time for the long Pentecost holiday weekend. CGTN's Natalie Carney has that story.
Tegernsee is back open for tourism. This beautiful lakeside resort town an hour south of Munich, close to the Austrian border, is a well-known weekend getaway. But since the onset of COVID-19 and subsequent lockdown in mid-March, all tourism traffic here effectively stopped. But the community is slowly crawling back to life, following the reopening of restaurants last week, and now that of hotels, guest houses and leisure facilities.
The biggest mantra that the government tells us is distance, 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 and I totally understand that. So we took out tables from the restaurants, all the guests, but also we have to run around with masks.
In some German states, there is a cap on the hotel's capacity, and in Bavaria, despite the hot weather, pools remain closed, yet guests don't seem to be bothered.
We missed it a lot because it was a tough time to being always at home, staying, only working, no free time, no such pretty places like this.
Despite a 60% occupancy rate here in the first few days of reopening, huge financial losses in the hotel industry are expected as a result of the coronavirus restrictions that have sunk the German economy into a deep recession.
Throughout the period of closures, hotels in the major cities were allowed to accept some essential overnight stays. It's more these smaller family-run facilities in more specific tourist locations that have really borne the brunt of the losses.
Economically, since the shutdown, we have a 100% loss of all revenue. We used the time as good as we could to do stuff which normally would influence guests in a negative way. So that's good, but the loss is terrible and we will not be able to recoup it.
A government short-term employment program has allowed many hotels to keep their staff, but other financial aid packages have not been enough to cushion the blow, says Kohler. In a boost to tourism ahead of the summer holidays, Germany will reopen its borders with France, Switzerland, Austria, Denmark, and to those arriving by air from Italy and Spain in mid-June. The concern now is over whether they will come. Natalie Carney for CGTN in Tegernsee.
The United Kingdom is also easing more of its pandemic restrictions, despite warnings from health officials of another spike in cases. More than 277,000 people have been infected in the UK. Nearly 40,000 people have died so far. Here's CGTN's Nicole Johnston with this report from London.
How are you both? Lovely to see you. You okay?
It's a cautious reopening in incremental steps. 2 million children are set to return to classrooms in England this week, but only certain grades. The maximum class size will be 15, with social distancing measures enforced. Parents are free to decide not to send their children. Teachers' unions say the opening is too soon.
If you keep the lockdown measures in place for 2 more weeks and open schools on June the 15th, then the rate of infection in children will have halved, and therefore their ability to pass on the virus will have halved.
Outdoor markets are back in business and car dealerships. The government says its scientific advice is that there's less chance of catching COVID-19 outdoors.
We must all remember that in the war against this virus, we are all on the same side. We've come so far together, we can take these steps together, but do not step too far.
And from Monday, larger groups can gather outside, up to 6 people in England, with slightly different rules for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. While many people in the UK are relieved the government's easing lockdown, there's also concern. Some of the government's own scientific advisors have said that the easing is happening too soon. The country's infection rate is only just below 1, and it risks a second wave if COVID-19 starts spreading rapidly in the community again. The government says its testing and tracing system will keep the virus under control. However, the system has been beset with technical problems, and the launch of a contact tracing app has been delayed. The UK went into lockdown later than other European countries. It's now coming out of it later and slower than its neighbours, and with the highest death toll in Europe. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
Let's pivot back into Asia. India's economy grew at its slowest rate in more than a decade in the first quarter of 2020 because of this pandemic. Migrant workers have been hardest hit in this downturn. Many of them lost their jobs in the large cities and they had to return home where there's little chance of employment. Local government have been looking for ways to help them. Here's CGTN's Ramah Nyang with this report from Delhi.
In the times of coronavirus pandemic, the wait to find work is endless. Despite relaxation in the lockdown restrictions in India, it's a challenge for these daily wage workers to find employment. Millions are struggling to make ends meet as there are no jobs in the market. Even if some are able to find work, they don't even get paid a minimum wage.
We come here to find work every day and have to return empty-handed. If someone comes to hire us, we demand a wage of $5 to $6, but they want to pay us half the money. How can I fend for my family with such an amount?
If this situation prevails for much longer, I will commit suicide as I cannot feed my children as I'm not getting any work. What can I do? Either I kill my children or myself.
The migrant workers are the worst hit during the lockdown. With all economic activity at a standstill in the cities, they lost their livelihoods. Millions are now back in their home states where the challenge of finding work is even greater. In order to restart economic activity and attract investments, state governments are diluting labor laws. In some states, the work hours have been increased by 4 hours.
What they are doing, that even at a low production level, how to retain my profit. And the only way is to cut the cost on labor. So suppress them, repress them, make them rightless, so that employers can be allowed to do whatever they like.
Labour unions have complained to the International Labour Organization, which has objected to the amendments in the labour laws. Meanwhile, the centre has also intervened to protect the rights of labour. The states are facing a financial crunch and are in a hurry to revive economic activities at the cost of the most marginalised. Ravinder Bava, CGTN, Delhi.
Now, Australia sees more money lost to gambling than virtually any other country. However, this year, because of the restrictions imposed to limit the spread of COVID-19, there's been a lot less gambling and therefore a lot more money saved. But what happens once those restrictions go out the window? CGTN's Greg Navarro explores that question.
Well, people across Sydney are beginning to enjoy the slow easing of restrictions.
It is such a treat, I can't tell you.
Other popular pastimes are still not an option. That includes a trip to pubs and clubs, to play electronic gambling machines, presenting gamblers with a unique windfall.
And that means that Australians are saving $1 billion a month. And that's money that's appearing in people's bank accounts, and they're able to pay the bills and put food on the table. And for many people who are gambling heavily, this has come as a huge relief across the country.
With Sportsbet. Gambling is a part of Australia's culture. Signs of that relationship are plentiful. Australians lose, not spend, but lose almost 25 billion Australian dollars a year on gambling. More than half of that money is pumped into electronic gambling machines. But that relationship comes at a cost. Gambling reform advocates say 3 out of every 4 people who play those machines are at risk for gambling harm.
So the idea that these machines are a fairly benign form of entertainment is really blown out of the water. It's very easy to wind up in a lot of trouble over a long period of time from gambling on poker machines.
I never thought I would end up with a gambling addiction. I never thought it would, be on my life resume. And it never goes away.
Anna Bardsley says she lost 10 years of her life and tens of thousands of dollars to an addiction to poker machines.
I turned into a completely other person. I hated who I had become. I was lying to myself and to other people about where I was and what I was doing. I was covering up the money I was spending. I had 2 jobs at the time, and all the money from that went into gambling.
While online gambling remains an option, health experts say they're not seeing a huge shift.
We're finding that they actually feel a sense of relief. They don't feel this urge to do anything to replace it. It's more just this sort of, well, I can't do it, so I'm not going to think about it sort of mentality is what we're really seeing.
That shutdown has crippled the gambling industry. New South Wales Clubs, which represents more than 1,200 clubs across the state, wasn't willing to talk to us for this story. It's reportedly said that more than 35,000 jobs have been lost and more than 40% of clubs across the state may not be able to reopen.
Gambling reform advocates claim during the global financial crisis, the gaming industry was actually targeting people receiving government checks as part of a stimulus package, money that was meant to help them weather the crisis.
This time round, we're very concerned that the JobKeeper money, the assistance that people have been getting that's very necessary, will be wasted once the poker machines come back online.
For now, gambling reform advocates are urging pubs and clubs to keep electronic machines off once they reopen, to give people left struggling because of the pandemic more time to recover. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Now then, like many other countries in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates is suffering from the economic damage inflicted by this pandemic. Travel restrictions, a steep fall in domestic spending and a decline in oil prices by over 50% have all combined to batter the country's economic prospects. But as Jacob Greaves now reports, some companies have been faring much better amidst all this chaos.
These home test kits are just part of NAPTA Health's attempts to change women's healthcare provision in the Middle East. The UAE-based firm are aiming to take female fertility treatments digital by combining home testing with app-based assessments. They have over 220,000 monthly users, and they say there's been an increase in interest amid COVID-19.
The 3,500 hospitals and clinics in the region in the country who were at 30% occupancy anyway have seen their footfall drop off, and they're all desperately trying now to figure out how they can continue to support their population in their homes. So that mind shift is happening for us. We will save millions of dollars in the near future because we don't have to convince everybody that this hybrid model of care, combining digital and traditional healthcare, is a good idea.
NAPTA Health aren't alone in the digital sphere. Amid lockdown and travel restrictions, e-commerce in the UAE and broader Middle East has surged.
The main winners have been in those supplying the essential goods. So e-groceries have seen demand skyrocket. A lot of the e-grocery startups in the region reported revenue growth of more than 100%. So they've really seen the positive side of this, as well as health tech companies and education technology companies, those specialized in distance and online learning, they've really improved.
The question is how long this trend will last post-pandemic, especially in a country like the UAE, which has some fairly lofty ambitions. Dubai's stated goal is to be the e-commerce hub in the region, with hopes it will contribute around $3.2 billion to the local economy by 2023. But that might depend on how much they can capitalise on any short-term changes to consumer spending habits brought about by coronavirus restrictions. Experts suggest one boost to regional e-commerce might be cashless payments becoming more commonplace amid the pandemic. But broadly speaking, digitisation in the Middle East is still playing catch-up.
The truth of the matter is, in many cases, whether it's e-commerce, healthcare or education, digital adoption has been lagging in the region compared to the rest of the world. And now, given that new habits are being formed, it's very likely that there is going to be increased demand that has longer lasting impact than was previously the case.
But even if there's hope for online firms, they still face similar economic headwinds buffeting more traditional bricks and mortar businesses, with startups in general grappling with an uncertain future as investors become more cautious.
The UAE is very representative of the rest of the region, so we've seen $320 million worth of investment between January and April of UAE-based startups. That's up about 30% on last year, but the number of deals have gone down to about 35 deals year over year, down 25%. And I think that the trend is showing that the bets are on more established, larger entities that are able to develop in this crisis, as opposed to the early bets. And that's why the number of deals are down, as opposed to the amount of funding, which is up.
And Philip notes the true impact of the pandemic might only be known later in the year when more data is available. For digitally minded firms like Napta Health, the current shift in consumer habits could provide opportunity, but it by no means guarantees a clean bill of health for the region's long-term e-commerce prospects. Jacob Greaves, CGTN in the UAE.
Right, then a quick run to commodity prices for you. So crude oil is just about knocking on that $40 a barrel level. We really haven't been there in quite a while. Decent rains, of course, in Cote d'Ivoire, the largest producer of cocoa in the world, could help boost the crop essentially from April through to September. Hopefully farmers expect that rain might last all the way up to July. One other thing coming out of East Africa, the Nairobi Coffee Exchange released sales data for the period between October last year and May, and we're seeing that sales over there actually fell by roughly a third, mostly because of restrictions imposed in order to deal with this pandemic. When trading does resume on the 7th of July, it will all entirely be done online. Here's what's coming up shortly. Online pizza sales offer a windfall for one entrepreneur in Zimbabwe. That story is coming up next.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Now, after restaurants are forced to close due to restrictions imposed to limit the spread of COVID-19, one Zimbabwean tech entrepreneur started an online pizza business to feed thousands of homebound clients. That business is thriving amidst these restrictions by serving a largely captive market in a sense. As CGTN's Farai Mukhtar now explains, the business has achieved its target for the quarter in just 3 weeks.
The immediacy of the opportunity meant the most important thing for Joseph Bunga to do was to make a start, then fine-tune things along the way.
Right, and you see, this is the thing about innovation. You constantly look at your product and say, how do I maximize? And a lot of this comes from me working in the tech sector. So minimum viable product. Don't build everything on day one. You can't. Ship small features on a regular basis and get things right. So we've constantly been looking at workflow. We've redesigned the kitchen in 3 weeks, probably 10 times. Moved things around and said, hey, that person's getting in the way of this person. Let's improve efficiency. So constantly focusing on improving efficiency.
Growth has exceeded expectations.
We are where we expected to be in 3 months at end of week 3. So huge acceleration.
That's made him bullish about the future. Joseph is an eternal optimist, and he believes that one day the world will be celebrating again, and they'll be doing so congregated around a delicious pizza.
We're already planning to expand into the region We want to go into the middle income markets because it's wood-fired. So 100 stores around the region. Our focus is very much delivery model, very much dark kitchen. The growth is going to come for us by expanding the types of thing that we are doing in the dark kitchen. So for example, we're doing pizza now. We're already experimenting with burgers. We're experimenting with curries.
Dark or cloud kitchens are likely to get a lift from the surge in e-commerce.
Dark kitchens are kitchens that are set up with no option for a sit-in restaurant. So dark kitchens, the model is that you can have 10 different brands. For example, we could be doing a McDonald's, a KFC in a dark kitchen, or people standing. We're focusing on what is core: your cooking environment, your cleanliness, your hygiene.
And making sure that all the meals are of the best quality. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
And finally, amidst this pandemic, street vendors have been hit particularly hard. The economic impact has been especially strongly felt in Kibera. It's an informal settlement in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, where many residents make a living by selling various goods on the streets. Young journalists from the Shine Kibera TV found this report for CGTN.
Amid the coronavirus pandemic, street vendors have been hit hard. And the harsh effects have been strongly felt in Kibera, an informal settlement in Kenya where many of the residents make their living selling goods on the side of the street. Kibera's young journalists from Shine Kibera TV reported on the story for CGTN. Take a look.
Kibera is the biggest slum in Africa. A drive-through will give you a picture that life is normal. But don't be deceived. The COVID-19 has changed people's lives very fast. Among those hit are the food vendors on the streets.
Customers hawako, watu sahi sasa wako kwa nyumba. Sasa na hawakuwa wamepata pesa, sasa haisongi. Kama ulikuwa unapika mifuko 4, umerudi chini kwa 1.5.
We meet another man who sells fresh juice at 42. For about an hour, I couldn't see a single shopper enter his shop.
Vile maisha ilikuwa kabla ya corona, watu walikuwa na pesa, walikuwa nauza vizuri. Saa hii maisha vile imekuwa ngumu, unapata uuzaji iko chini. Saa hii unapata mtu anashughulika tu na chakula, mahitaji ya nyumba, lakini ukipata kama ni mahitaji mengine inamlemea. So nafikiria inafaa kuwe na mkono kama wa serikali hivi, ama masilika siwe zinasaidia pande nyingine.
Moses counts himself lucky whenever he sees a customer. And now as you can see, you just have to sit and wait.
Tunjikinge, ile kitu mtu ako naye kidogo anjaribu kuitumia kwa njia inayostahili, ndio tunjui hii corona itachukua muda gani.
A few yards from Moses' shop, I meet Joshua who sells grocery just by the roadside, and he shares the same experience.
Vile tunauza kiwango chini sana. Na ile kitu tunaweza kuomba hii ugonjwa iishe kwa sababu imetufungia kila kitu.
He is lucky to get a few customers, perhaps because it's approaching lunchtime. His area of concern is the curfew.
Ile masaa watu walikuwa wanakuja kununua vitu. Hiyo masaa ndio tunafunga naye.
Such are the challenges local business owners go through in Kibera. I am Sylvia Adhiambo.
And we'll leave it there for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The news continues on CGTN.